Hey. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Ezekiel Class. If you're with us at home, we pray that the Lord is blessing you this week, and we welcome you back to Ezekiel Class. We are in Ezekiel Class number 37 today, and we're going to be studying two different chapters of Ezekiel. It's Ezekiel chapter 41 and Ezekiel chapter 42. And we are still looking at the millennial temple. We're not tempted, it's the millennial temple. And sorry for that. And this will be our second class on the structure of the millennial temple, the actual architecture and measurements and all that on it. So we should be done with that at the end of this class probably. And next week we're going to begin moving into some other pieces about the temple. So I'm going to do this. This is a very, last week it was kind of mind-numbing with all the detail we went through about all the temple measurements. And as mind-numbing as that was last week, this one, to be very honest, will probably be a little bit more mind-numbing than that one was. These two chapters, and that's why I'm going to combine them together, are very, very, very detailed in terms of descriptions of numbers about the temple. Last week we looked at the outer part of the temple, and we kind of left this center part for this week. You'll notice I filled in a whole lot. Last week I just had the word temple in here. Now there's a lot here. We're going to see a lot. We're going to go through a complete description of the inner temple, and it's important because that's where Jesus will be during the millennial kingdom. Jesus is going to rule the world from right here during the millennial kingdom, from right here someplace during the millennial kingdom. So God has given us a whole lot of detail. Last week Stephen asked the question, why are we getting all this arithmetic detail, all these numbers about it? And I can't give you a great explanation of that. I'm going to give you some ideas of it as we get to the close of the class. But I think we all need to have faith that if the Lord has given us all these numbers and all this architectural detail, there's a reason, and maybe we don't understand it yet. But there is a reason for all of it. And since this thing is way out in the future, it may be that we may begin to understand it later as time goes by. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you the entire thing. And as I say, it is going to be a little mind-numbing. I'm going to read you the entire thing, and then we're going to walk through it verse by verse. So if you'll open your Bibles, and those of you at home, please open your Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 41 and chapter 42. I'm going to read the entire thing for you from start to finish. So Ezekiel's in the temple. By the way, the date that Ezekiel's doing this is on April 28th of 673 BC, and this is about 13 years after the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Now, there are people that think that this has something to do with Solomon's temple, and it does have something to do with Solomon's temple, but Solomon's temple is way different from the description that we see here. The description of Solomon's temple is vastly different. So let's go through this. Then the man brought me to the main hall and measured the jambs. The width of the jambs was 6 cubits on each side. By the way, the main hall is this part right here. The entrance was 10 cubits wide, and the projecting walls on each side of it were 5 cubits wide. He also measured the main hall. It was 40 cubits long and 20 cubits wide. That would be this part back here. And he measured the length of the inner sanctuary. It was 20 cubits, and its width was 20 cubits across the end of the main hall. So that's this part back here. He said to me, "This is the most holy place." Then he measured the wall of the temple. It was 6 cubits thick, and each side room around the temple was 4 cubits wide. The side rooms were on 3 levels, one above another, 30 on each level. There were ledges all around the wall of the temple to serve as support for the side rooms. Excuse me. So that the supports were not inserted into the wall of the temple. The side rooms all around the temple were wider at each successive level. The structure surrounding the temple was built in ascending stages, so that the rooms widened as one went upward. A stairway went up from the lowest floor to the top floor through the middle floor. I saw that the temple had a raised base all around it, forming the foundation of the side rooms. It was the length of the rod, 6 cubits. The outer wall of the side rooms was 5 cubits thick. The open area between the side rooms of the temple and the priest's rooms was 20 cubits wide all around the temple. There were entrances to the side rooms from the open area, one on the north and one on the south, and the base adjoining the open area was 5 cubits all around. Excuse me. The building facing the temple courtyard on the west side was 70 cubits wide. The wall of the building was 5 cubits thick all around, and its length was 90 cubits. Then he measured the temple. It was 100 cubits long, and the temple courtyard and the building with its walls were also 100 cubits long. The width of the temple courtyard on the east, including the front of the temple, was 100 cubits. Then he measured the length of the building facing the courtyard at the rear of the temple, including its galleries on each side. It was 100 cubits. The main hall, the inner sanctuary, and the portico facing the court, as well as the thresholds and the narrow windows and galleries around the 3 of them, everything beyond and including the threshold was covered with wood. The floor, the wall up to the windows, and the windows were covered. In the space above the outside of the entrance to the inner sanctuary, and on the walls at regular intervals all around the inner and outer sanctuary, were carved cherubim and palm trees. Palm trees alternated with cherubim. Each cherub had 2 faces, the face of a human being toward the palm tree on one side, and the face of a lion toward the palm tree on the other. They were carved all around the whole temple. From the floor of the area above the entrance, cherubim and palm trees were carved on the wall of the main hall. The main hall had a rectangular door frame, and the one at the front of the most holy place was similar. There was a wooden altar 3 cubits high and 2 cubits square. Its corners, its base, and its sides were of wood. I did not put that up here. Let me do that. The man said to me, "That is the table that is before the Lord." Both the main hall and the most holy place had double doors. Each door had 2 leaves, 2 hinged leaves on each door. And the doors on the main hall were carved cherubim and palm trees like those carved on the walls. And there was a wooden overhang on the front of the portico. On the side walls of the portico were narrow windows with palm trees carved on each side. The side rooms of the temple also had overhangs. Then the man led me northward into the outer court and brought me to the rooms opposite the temple courtyard and opposite the outer wall on the north side. The building whose door faced north was 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide, both in the section 20 cubits from the inner court and in the section opposite the pavement of the outer court. Gallery faced gallery at the 3 levels. In front of the rooms was an inner passage 10 cubits wide and 100 cubits long. Their doors were on the north. Now the upper rooms were narrower, for the galleries took more space from them than from the rooms on the lower and middle floors of the building. The rooms on the top floor had no pillars as the courts had, so they were smaller in floor space than those on the lower and middle floors. There was an outer wall parallel to the rooms and the outer court. It extended in front of the rooms for 50 cubits, while the row of rooms on the side next to the outer court was 50 cubits long. The row next to the side nearest the sanctuary was 100 cubits long. The lower rooms had an entrance on the east side as one enters them from the outer court. Excuse me. On the south side, along the length of the wall of the outer court, adjoining the temple courtyard and opposite the outer wall, were rooms, with a passageway in front of them. These were like the rooms on the north. They had the same length and width, the same exits and dimensions. Similar to the doorways on the north were the doorways of the rooms on the south. There was a doorway at the beginning of the passageway that was parallel to the corresponding wall extending eastward by which one enters the rooms. Then he said to me, "The north and south rooms facing the temple courtyards are the priests' rooms, where the priests who approach the Lord will eat the most holy offerings. There they will put the most holy offerings, the grain offerings, the sin offerings, and the guilt offerings, for the place is holy. Once the priests enter the holy precincts, they are not to go into the outer court until they leave behind the garments in which they minister, for these are holy. They are to put on other clothes before they go near the places that are for the people." When he had finished measuring what was inside the temple area, he led me out to the east gate and measured the area all around. So we're all the way back out to here now. Measure the area all around. He measured the east side with the measuring rod. It was 500 cubits. He measured the north side. It was 500 cubits by the measuring rod. He measured the south side. It was 500 cubits by the measuring rod. Then he turned to the west side and measured. It was 500 cubits by the measuring rod. So he measured the area on all four sides. It had a wall around it, 500 cubits long, 500 cubits wide, to separate the holy from the common. Has everybody got that? Everybody got all those details? As you can tell, we're not gonna crawl through every single bit of that, okay? What I'm going to do is show you what the temple really looks like as Ezekiel described it here. And I've studied a whole lot of these things to come up with this. So, remember last week we talked. We have an outer wall. This is the blue wall, which is 500 cubits by 500 cubits. That is 800 and some feet, 875 I think it is. So when you measure the total circumference, that's 2,000 cubits, right? 4 times 500. That's about 3,500 feet around. It's about 2/3 of a mile around, to give you an idea. So going around this temple is 2/3 of a mile. This is immense. It is way bigger than Solomon's temple, by the way. It is immense. And there's an outer wall, and there's a gate in that wall in each of the 3 locations. And then there's an outer courtyard that goes around. By the way, there are steps up to the first gate. There's an outer courtyard. And then there's an inner wall here. And that inner wall has a bunch of rooms and stuff in it. It also has porticos in it where people can meet. And that's the inner wall here. The inner wall also has 3 gates in exactly the same directions as the outer walls. And again, there are steps. There are more steps going up here. There are actually 8 steps going up here. And then inside of that, there's an inner courtyard, which is this here. And in the middle of it is an altar. And the altar is where the sacrifices are going to get made. We haven't talked much about those. That's going to be next week's class. But the sacrifices are going to get made on the altar. And then the rest of it is the real guts of the temple, and that's what we're going to get into this week. First of all, up here you have something called the priest's kitchen. But let me start. There are 2 different groups of priests. On the north side, you have the priests who just do the day-to-day work in the temple, and there's a lot of it. On the south side, you have the Zadok priests, and that comes back from Zadok in the Bible, who at the time when David and Saul were arguing over who was going to be king, they took care of the ark, and they chose eventually to go with David, which was the correct answer. And then later on, when Solomon came to the throne, Zadok was still around, by the way, and Zadok allied with Solomon and helped him with the beginning of the temple construction. So Zadok is a very special priest in Israel's history. The priests that are descended from Zadok are down here in the south. And they have priest quarters in here. I'll explain that in a minute. And basically, these are the priests who will actually serve Jesus. They will actually be in here, in this area, serving Jesus and actually performing the sacrifices. So that's a different group of priests down here. So these are priests' quarters. Each one of these has 30 rooms. So you got about 45 rooms up here and 45 rooms down here. So there's a lot of priests in this temple, right? A lot of priests. Now, when you get up to the main temple area, a couple of things. First of all, there's this gigantic building in the back of the temple, which is, well, I don't have it up here. It's this gigantic building in the back of the temple. Doesn't tell us what it's for. It's probably for storage. That seems to be the most likely answer of what it's for. But there's this big building, not terribly thick walls, not quite, it just doesn't tell us what it is. It just tells us there's this big building back here. We assume it's probably for storage, but there doesn't seem to be a purpose to it. It's right up against the west wall, the back wall of the temple. And then the main part of the temple is all going to be in here. Now, as you come up from the altar, you'll come upstairs. Here, I'm going to move to this one now. As you come into the main part of the temple, you will come up a set of stairs, and this is on a platform. And the platform is 10 feet high, so it's 10 feet off the ground. That's pretty high up to get up there. So the priests have to come up the stairs from the altar. Remember, the altar's out here. The priests have to come up the stairs from the altar, and then they will come up onto this platform. And the platform is the blue area here that goes around the outside of it. And then you get to the, as we're coming in, we're getting progressively holier in this thing, right? Each thing is getting more holy. So the only people that are going to be allowed up here are going to be the Zadok priests. Those are the priests that are serving Jesus while he's in the temple, and they're serving the sacrifices out here. So they're going to come up here to this. Now, around here, these green things are priests' changing areas. I'm going to throw you a number here. There are 180 of them. 180 priests' changing areas. That should start to give you an idea of how many people are going to be coming through this temple. This is where priests take their garments off and put their garments on. And then their garments have to be specially handled. They can't, once the priest has finished what he's doing in the temple, he cannot just go out and meet the people and shake hands, right? He has to take his garment off. It has to be carefully taken care of at that point until he comes back to put it on again later. So we don't know exactly what this means, but it means there are at least 180 priests that are working this part of the temple. As we talk about this over the next few weeks, you're going to realize there are millions of people who are going to come through this temple every year. I haven't proven that to you yet. I will over the next few weeks. But millions of people are going to come through this temple every year. So this is a massive operation going on here. So the priests are going to change in these rooms. These rooms are on 3 different levels. Now, I said some of these numbers are meaningful. This is the first time we've seen the number 3. I wonder if 3 has anything to do with the persons of God. We don't know. I'm going to get into this subject later of the meaning of the numbers in here. But there are 3 different levels of these rooms. And interestingly enough, architecturally, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but the Lord's going to make it work. The lower level of rooms is going to be relatively narrow. The next level is going to be wider, and the top level is going to be wider still. Interesting architecture, right? You can do that. Today we have materials that you can do that with. I don't know if you could do it with stones in those days, but when Ezekiel was thinking about this, and we don't know what materials God's going to use in this temple. We have no idea what materials God will use. But the architecture seems a little strange. But in today's world, we can understand that you can build that way. You can build buildings up like this today and have them stand up and not fall down the next time the wind hits. So apparently that's it. Each of these rooms, so the lower level of rooms will be narrow. The next level will be wider, and the upper level will be wider still. There's going to be a stairway up the middle. There's also going to be an entrance on the outer wall, which I didn't put in here. There's going to be a stairway on this side as well. So you'll be able to come up a stairway and get to any of the levels through there. All of this is in what I read to you. It's all in, everything I'm talking about is in what I just read to you. And there'll also be a stairway over here as well. So the priests will come up and down to the levels, and they will get changed up there. And then we look at the design of the actual interior as we're getting deeper and deeper into the temple. By the way, an interesting thing, this wall, this blue wall here that goes around, is completely flush, top to bottom. Which means that as these walls are going, or as the rooms are getting wider going up, if this wall is flush, that means the first room is to here, the second room is to here, the third room is to here. That means the walls of the temple are actually coming up inside the temple. The inside of the temple is coming up almost like a steeple. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the inside of this is not flat like this roof. The inside of this is rising up in there. So it's going to look kind of, I don't know if it's a vaulted ceiling or what it's going to be in there, but it will be much narrower at the ceiling in here, in this holy place, than it is at the base. Interesting. Again, we don't know what materials God's going to use to construct this temple out of, but it'll work. I guarantee it'll work. So, now, we have these very thick walls here that are going to be around the most holy place and around the holy place. And this is like Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple had a place that was the holy place, and then they had another place that was called the Holy of Holies, which is a very similar concept. And remember, the Spirit of God, the presence of God was in the Holy of Holies. And the priests, only certain priests were allowed to even enter the holy place, and those were the priests of Zadok. And they are allowed to bring things in, bring offerings into the Lord, into the holy place. There is a table right in here. It's made out of wood. That's right in front of the entrance to the most holy place. Oh, by the way, you'll notice there are three entrances here. One gets to the portico. This is a portico. This entrance is quite wide. The second entrance gets to the holy place. That's narrower. And the third entrance gets into the Holy of Holies. That is narrower still. So the idea is the entrances get narrower as you go deeper into the temple. That makes sense? I've tried to draw them that way. I think you can get a sense of that at least. So there's a portico out here, and then there's and priests are allowed into that. There's a holy place. You'll notice as he went through this, by the way, remember from way back in our original, when we first met Ezekiel back in chapter 1, Ezekiel said that he was a priest. He was a priest in Jerusalem. So he had reached the point where he was a priest. So Ezekiel, you'll notice, went in with the man into here. Then he went in with the man into here. But when the man went in and measured in here, Ezekiel didn't go in because he is not a high priest. And only high priests are allowed to go in here. And there can only be one of those at a time in Israel. So when Ezekiel got to that point, he stopped here at this table and he did not enter. He looked at the entrance and he looked inside, but he didn't go in because he's not a high priest. So the holy place is where there's a whole bunch of stuff, the candelabra and a bunch of things that are in there. The most holy place in the old temple, in Solomon's temple, was where the Ark of the Covenant was, and there was also the menorah in there, and there were a couple of lamps in there. And interestingly enough, in Solomon's temple, since nobody could enter there except the high priest, and that was only one day a year he was allowed to go in, they had to have holes in the roof so that they could pull the lamps up to the roof to put more oil in the lamps, and then lower the lamps back down. So there were people up on the roof, and they would open the holes in the roof, pull the lamps up, pour the oil in, and then lower the lamp back down. That was how they kept the lamps lit. There was an eternal flame going in there, and they had to make sure the lamps were all lit permanently in there. So it doesn't say anything about that in this temple, by the way, but that's how it worked in Solomon's temple. So basically, once the priests get done with the offerings here, and There were 3 types of offerings. There were grain offerings, burnt offerings, and sin offerings. And I'm going to talk about those next week. I'm not going to get into what those are this week. But once the priests are done out here at the altar with the offerings, then they bring them in and place them in front of the Lord on the table. And they don't place all of it in front of it. Some of it goes in front of the Lord. Some of it goes back here to the kitchen. And the priests can eat that. The priests have the ability. The regular priest can eat certain things in this kitchen, and the Zadok priest can eat other things in this kitchen. So they're actually allowed to eat some of the offerings. And that's true of the Levitical priests as well that were in the original temple. Yeah.
How do you think they got into the storage area? Because there's no door from the kitchens, and I wouldn't think they would go through the temple.
Yeah, there actually is. I didn't draw it well enough. There actually is. The temple part in here.
That's that drawing over there on the left.
I have this like this. It actually looks like this. So the temple part that I have here is actually in here. There is a space behind here. So this inner court does continue behind there.
Oh, okay.
And there is a way to get in back there. Good question. Yeah. Pardon my artwork. No, sorry. I'm doing my best here. As Deb knows, every now and then my grandchildren will come up to me and say, "Grandpa, can you help me color inside the lines?" It's like, no, I don't do that. I can't stay in the lines. So, my 6-year-old colors better inside the lines than I do. Not my deal. God gave me certain gifts. Coloring inside the lines is not one of them, and artwork is not one of them. It's just not my thing. But luckily, this is pretty. Oh, by the way, one interesting thing you'll see. If you go down this dashed line here, you'll see that this is the axis of the temple. And everything up here is a mirror image of everything down here. It is exactly the same. Everything up here is exactly the mirror image of everything down here, all the way around the temple. And that's one of the beauties of it. There is a whole lot of drafting kind of beauties. A draftsman would love looking at this temple, because there is a whole lot of symmetry to everything that God has done here. So God is all about symmetry, right? God makes things perfect. And this is perfect. It is all, my artwork certainly doesn't look perfect, but this is all perfect. All of these areas, this area is exactly the same as that area, this area is the same as that area, this area is the same as that area, even though it doesn't look it. This area is the same as that area, and so on. All of these areas are all perfect all the way around. I'm sure if you went into every room with today's measuring tapes and measured them, you'd find they're all perfect. So this is the perfection of God.
Ezekiel is seeing this in a vision.
Correct.
He was taken there in a vision.
Yes.
Is he the only one who saw this particular situation?
That's a great question. Let me spend a couple minutes on that. The millennial kingdom is a time that is looked forward to by almost all the prophets in the Old Testament. Almost all the prophets in the Old Testament have a verse here and a verse there and a couple of verses here and a couple of verses there about how great things are going to be during the millennial kingdom. But the only place it's fully developed is in what we are studying here in Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapters 33 through 49, which we're right in the middle of now, is the only place in the entire Bible where the millennial kingdom is really expanded and shown in great detail. Other than that, you find some verses here and there. Jeremiah has tons of verses. There are tons of verses in Hosea. Isaiah has tons of verses. There are just tons of verses about the millennial kingdom all over the Old Testament. But it's never all put together like it is here in these 17 or whatever it is, 16 chapters, 17, I don't know, 16 or 17 chapters of Ezekiel. This is the best, most detailed vision of the millennial kingdom. And the center point of the millennial kingdom is the temple. That's where Jesus will be. So that's why we're going to have 9 chapters about the temple. And Ezekiel's giving us a tremendous amount of detail here. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why, maybe. And I don't know the answer to why, but I'll speculate a little bit later in the class on why he may have that level of detail. But thanks for the question. Did I answer it?
Well, yeah. The other thing that's so amazing about this is the level of detail.
Yeah.
You see this in a vision, and certainly when Ezekiel put this paper or penned it, he had all this information, detail, in a extremely detailed amount of information for us.
Exactly. That leads to some interesting conclusions. I'm going to get to my conclusions about what I think Ezekiel's trying to tell us about this temple. But first I want to make sure are there any other questions about the structure of the temple that people want to ask me before we start talking about what's Ezekiel trying to tell us here, or what's God trying to tell us through this?
No elevators.
Yeah. Technology might be a little different then. We don't, if God's giving us everything and food is totally available and people aren't dying and people aren't getting sick and all that stuff, which is the millennial kingdom, maybe we don't need elevators. Maybe all of us can climb stairs, right? I don't know. So.
Well, we got our new bodies.
That's right. Well, we've got our new bodies, but not everybody has their new bodies. There will be people that will be 1,000 years old in the millennial kingdom. That's a whole other interesting issue.
So does the millennial kingdom go back to where it rains, or do they not need a roof? Does it rain?
It definitely rains because the Lord talks about the fact, and we haven't come to this yet. This is in chapter 44, I believe it is, which will be a couple of weeks from now. The Lord talks about the fact that people have to come to this temple if they're sinners once a year. They must come here once a year, and if they don't, they will get no rain on their crops. So there must be rain. Good question. Other things? Okay, why? Why is the Lord giving us this level of detail? Okay. Let me give you a couple, and this is on the last page of your handout. By the way, my first 3 pages of your handout, take what I read to you and put it into this, okay? Feel free to dive through it. I've tried to put in there exactly how each of those specs in there translates into something that's up here. And if you're willing to spend many hours going through my first 3 pages, I think you'll see that it's exactly what I put up here on the board. So let's go to the 4th page, which is really talking about the question, or actually it begins at the very bottom of the 3rd page. As we finish our tour of the Millennial Temple, a couple of things. First of all, as Ben just said, there's incredible precision in these measurements, incredible precision. And Ezekiel got them all. He gave us hundreds of measurements about this temple. It would be impossible to create this in today's world even without drafting tools. You couldn't design, you couldn't draw this temple without the proper drafting tools and the proper drafting education in today's world. It's pretty amazing that somebody 2,600 years ago could have a vision and sit down and write this stuff up. It's pretty amazing. That's the first thing. Second thing is, there's no way Ezekiel could possibly have invented this precise level of detail that is so accurate. I mean, this all fits together. People have spent, architectural people have spent tons of time looking at this, and sure enough, it all works. All these walls are exactly, with all the measurements, exactly the way Ezekiel gives it to us. It all works. It all comes out to be exactly what he's describing, which is interesting. So the detail's way too accurate for a guy who was a priest in a temple with no drafting experience and no architectural experience to have been able to just invent it himself, right? This clearly came from God. Third thing is, this isn't just some kind of symbol or some kind of metaphor. Somebody asked me the question last week, is it possible this is a metaphor for Solomon's temple? I don't think so. First of all, Solomon's temple looked very different than this. And secondly, this is way too specific. This is a real building that's being described here. This is a building that will exist. Now, there are many people out there that will argue, well, there's not really ever going to be a millennial kingdom. That's all metaphor in the Bible. No, I don't think so. This building is way too specific. It has to be a real building. It really would work as a real building. So this is a real building. This is not some kind of symbol of something else. It's not a metaphor. This is a place where Jesus will really rule the world from during the millennial kingdom. Next question. Well, maybe this building's already been built someplace in the past. I mean, it was 2,600 years ago that Ezekiel gave it to us. No, there's never been a building that looks anything remotely like this in Israel. This is so much bigger than Solomon's temple, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, remember, okay? This is so much bigger than Solomon's temple, and so much more involved than Solomon's temple. I mean, 180 priests' rooms? This is a big place, big place. 180 changing rooms for priests. So nothing like this has ever existed in Israel before. So this is something that's coming in the future. It obviously doesn't exist in our time. This is something that's coming in the future. And we know it's going to be in Jerusalem. We saw that earlier on. This is on the mountain. Remember, at the beginning, Ezekiel told us this was on the high mountain in Jerusalem. And Zechariah talked to us more about that mountain. Now, next thing. And this goes back to a question. Unfortunately, Stephen's not here, but he asked the question last week of why all this detail? Why is the Lord giving us all this detail? I don't have a good answer for you, except that he's giving it to us for a reason. That's why I insisted on reading every word of it to you today. I know it was almost incomprehensible. I've spent weeks getting ready for this class. It's almost incomprehensible to me, and I've studied it for weeks as to how all this fits together, how all these numbers really work, and why would God have given us all this level of detail? He didn't have to give us this level of detail. So, is there something about all these numbers? You notice there's a lot of 5 cubits or 50 cubits. There's a lot of 6 cubits or 60 cubits. There's a lot of 4 cubits or 40 cubits. There's a lot of 3s. There's a lot of 7s in here and 70 cubits. There's a lot of 8s. There's a lot of 10s. Why all these numbers? Why did God give us all these numbers? And what's the connection between, this one being 60 and this one being 40 or whatever? Are there connections between all these numbers? Now, if you go back to the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, Jewish rabbis for generations, for 3,500 years, have taken every little measurement in the original, in God's measurements that he gave us for the original tent, the original tabernacle, and done incredible amounts of work on the relationships between those numbers and the meanings of those numbers. And I don't know what of that is true and what of that isn't true. The Bible, it's beyond the scope of the Bible, but they've taken numbers out of the Bible and put those numbers together to come up with various meanings. And some of those may be true and some of them may not. But they've done 3,500 years of work on that. And today there's tons of stuff out there, if you want to look it up, about the meaning of the measurements in the tabernacle, because Jewish rabbis have done that for 3,500 years. Now, interestingly enough, about 40 years ago, I read the first of the Bible code books. Anybody ever read any of the Bible code books?
I've seen it, but I haven't studied it.
I read the first of it.
Yeah.
This could never have been done until modern computers came out. And there are relationships in the original Hebrew letters of the first 5 books of the Bible. Remember, the first 5 books of the Bible, God gave very specific instructions. You must copy these exactly, letter for letter, the way I gave them to you, Moses. And from here on in, if you ever start copying one of these scrolls and you make a mistake on even one of these, you have to burn the scroll and start all over again. So you can't make a mistake on any single letter in there. And it's interesting, if you look at scrolls in Jewish temple or Jewish synagogues, pardon me, thank you. I'm getting older, I'm starting to forget words. If you look at the scrolls in Jewish synagogues all around the world, they're almost identical. I mean, if you take 2 different scrolls from 2 different synagogues 1,000 miles apart and compare them, you might, if you're lucky, you might find one letter that's different. Probably in many cases no letters, because they've been so meticulous over such a long period of time. Because of that, what a lot of people started doing about 40 years ago when modern computers became available was putting in things about the various letters and the sequences of the letters, and even what ones were above what ones and next to what ones and so on, and doing mathematical analyses of them, and they came up with some shocking things. They came up with predictions about the future. Now, whether those are true or not, I don't know. I've read most of the Bible code books because I was a math minor in college, But there's certainly a good chance that God baked all kinds of stuff into that original code that he told Moses to copy so meticulously. There's at least a chance that that is correct. So it's possible that there are things there. Now, that kind of work has never been done on Ezekiel for a number of reasons. So that kind of work has never been done on these numbers. I have been unable to find a book anywhere analyzing all these numbers and what do they mean? What's the meanings of all these different numbers? A couple of reasons. Number one is this book wasn't copied as meticulously over years as the 5 books of the Torah were. So that's part of it. And the other part is that a lot of Jewish rabbis have trouble with the book of Ezekiel. It assumes some things that's difficult for them. It assumes that this presence of God in there, who is it? What is it? They don't believe in Jesus. What is it? So it becomes difficult for them. And it also raises the question of if the presence of God left the temple in 586 BC, what was in all the temples after that in Jerusalem? Was there anything in there? Was the ark in there? Was the presence of God in there? Raises some questions about the validity of those temples. And at any rate, for a whole lot of reasons, the math work on Ezekiel has never been done to the way it's been done on the first 5 books of the Bible. So we don't know. If you want to, win a Nobel Prize in religion someday, go do the math work on the book of Ezekiel and figure out what all these numbers mean. Like I said, I was a math minor. I can't figure it out. But there's probably a lot of symbolism that God has put into those numbers. He didn't throw those numbers in by accident. And by the way, don't look at them in feet. Look at them in cubits, which is how they're in there. Look at them. Look at all the measurements in cubits. Next point. The size of this temple is simply immense. Millions of people are going to go through this a year. I haven't proven that to you, but I will over the next few weeks. Millions of people will go through this temple every year, and they will come through it at the same time every year. There's an 8-day period in October called the Feast of Tabernacles, and they will go through it during that period. As we're going to see later on in our study, in a couple chapters in the future, non-believers, people who have not accepted Christ from all nations in the world, will be required to go through this every year. If they don't go through it every year, like I said, there'll be no rain, and that means they won't have crops. Sounds like, it's not absolutely clear, sounds like meat might not be happening during the millennial kingdom. We may have a different relationship with animals than we have today. We may not slay them and eat them today. We may not, I don't know. There's a lot of argument about that one. But so crops may be the main reason, the main way people are fed in the future. And if they don't have rain, that could be a problem. And people, if they don't accept Christ by their 100th birthday, will die. We've covered that one thoroughly. So people under 100 are going to have to come here every year and walk through this temple. There are going to be millions and millions of them in the world. They're going to have to go through this temple every year. So what's the purpose of this temple? It's an evangelism tool. The purpose of this temple and all the sacrificing that's going to happen here, I'm going to talk about the sacrificing starting next week. The purpose of this temple is to be an evangelism tool. It's going to be to bring people to Christ during the millennium. People who are born with natural bodies during the millennium. There will be many of them. They will need to come to Christ. They will need to come to faith just like we do. Things are going to be a lot easier in one respect. Satan's going to be gone. There will be no Satan in the world. There will be no demons in the world. They're all going to be gone. In addition to that, there are going to be hundreds of millions of us, people in immortal bodies, people in sinless bodies. Our job is going to be to help Jesus rule the world. And it says that Jesus is going to communicate with us in a way where we won't even have to, we won't see him, we won't have to ask the question, he'll just give us the answer. So he'll say, hey, Harvey and Joe over there, they're getting ready to argue about something, go take care of it. Here's what you need to tell Harvey, here's what you need to tell Joe, go fix the problem, right? I don't know how that's all going to work exactly, but something like that. So we're going to be out there making sure that interpersonal sin between people is pretty much not happening during this period. So you've got no Satan, Christ is present in the world, and you've got hundreds of millions of us out there solving interpersonal problems so things don't get between people and people, and yet there's still sin. There's still going to be sin in the world. It's because the human body is sinful. human. To be human is to be sinful. So people have to, the only answer to that is the same answer we have. They have to accept Christ. And they have to do it within the first 100 years. They have 100 years to make the decision. Next point of this, Israel's the center of the world. During the millennial kingdom, all worship, all government, all teaching is going to center on Israel. That's where it's going to be. Now that's kind of true today, but most people don't realize it. I had an interesting discussion with a person here before class about Israel, the state. Where's Israel's place in the world today? A lot of people don't realize how important Israel's place in the world is today. Israel is God's chosen people. That didn't change. Israel did not accept the Messiah, and that has cost them dearly over the last 2,000 years. But it doesn't change the fact that they are still God's chosen people. And when the millennial kingdom comes, every promise God made them will be fulfilled. They will be the center of the world in the millennial kingdom. So, Satan's gone for 1,000 years, and yet sin is obviously going to become pretty prevalent, because eventually we're going to have the Gog and Magog war, right? So, that's why this temple's required. That's why we need a myriad of guards. Remember, we have guards guarding the gates out here. We have guards. Why don't we need guards if there's no sin in the world? Well, there is sin in the world. That's the point. There is sin in the world. Remember, there are going to be guards at the gates out here. So we're going to have guards. We need all these priests. We have to have 180 rooms for priests. We need all these priests to help people come to Christ during that period. So, sin is obviously out there during this period. Those of us that are believers today who accept Christ before the rapture will have sinless, imperishable bodies. And it says in Revelation 20, we will help him reign and rule for 1,000 years. We will be there helping him deal with this situation. We will be part of his evangelism tool in the world at that point. It will be our job to work with people to help bring them to faith in Christ. That will be our mission during that period. We're going to help him rule and reign. So, with Christ's perfect rule in the world, sin's going to be minimized, but it's not going to be eliminated. It will still be present. It's going to be a very different world than we live in today. I mean, imagine a world without Satan, for one thing. Imagine a world where hundreds of millions of people in perfect bodies are walking around helping you every day. Imagine a world where anybody who gets into that world to begin with is saved. They're already saved. They've already accepted Christ. And imagine a world where our main job is to, since babies are going to be born like crazy during that period, our main job is going to be to help those children come to Christ. That's what this temple's for. So I'm going to stop here this week, and we're done now with the rough part of this. I was telling Deb on the way over, Lord, give me the ability to present this in a way. And at first I was going to go through this, every one of these instructions, like I did in my 3 pages of notes, every one of these instructions, and explain to you what they mean. I'm not going to do that. It's just, I guarantee it wouldn't have gone well. So if you want to, though, it's all in here. My 3 pages, my opening 3 pages tell you exactly how these words in the scriptures convert into this. Feel free to go through it. Ask me any questions if you want, whenever you want, about how this temple goes. Next week, we're going to start getting into the subject of sacrifice. What on earth is going on here, right? Jesus is in this world. Why do we need sacrifices? Hundreds of millions of people are out there helping him reign and rule. Why do we need sacrifices in this temple? That is the big question Christians ask. Why do we need sacrifices in this temple? And I'm going to start to answer that. It may take me 2 weeks to complete the next 2 classes I'm going to do on sacrificing in general and sacrificing in this temple and what it's going to be all about. So that's where we're going next. And then 3 weeks from now, Jesus is going to come into this temple. So we're going to see that. Thank you. For those of you at home, thank you, and please have a blessed week.